Senator Smith.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thank you, Senator Abetz. I'm keen to get to the Productivity Commission and Commonwealth Grants Commission to talk about GST distribution reform this afternoon.
Can I review that, Chair?
But if I could just get an update on the work to date on Australia's bid for a seat on the Human Rights Council at the United Nations. Apologies if this has been traversed before.
No, not at all. Certainly, Senator Smith. I'll invite Lachlan Strawn, who's head of the relevant division, the Multilateral Policy Division, to join me at the table.
Thank you, Senator. Lachlan Strawn, First Assistant Secretary, Multilateral Policy Division. The vote for our Human Rights Council candidacy takes place in the middle of October, so we're into the last 5 months of the campaign. As I've said at previous estimate sessions, we're running for one of 2 seats in the WEOG group against France and Spain. What I do is stress that France and Spain, of course, are opponents, competitors not to be taken lightly. They're major EU countries with large foreign services, and naturally they're taking the campaign seriously. But what I could stress very much is that we have a very rigorous, well-run campaign which we've now been conducting for several years. Can I say that the campaign is led by the Foreign Minister. She is very much our point person, the spearhead for this campaign. She has raised the campaign in multilateral, regional and bilateral contexts now for several years. Can also say that she wrote to her ministerial counterparts last year and asked for their support. And I think it's very pleasing that we've now got actually a very big team effort, and this has been the case for quite some months. So Senator Fierravanti-Wells in our own portfolio has been raising our candidacy in multilateral, regional and bilateral contexts. So has the Trade Minister, so have other ministers in the Cabinet, including the Minister for Justice, the Minister for Defence, to give you just a couple of examples. As is also well known, we have a Special Envoy, Philip Ruddock, who has been working on the campaign now for almost a year. He has conducted 7 trips overseas for the campaign. He's doing an 8th right now. Can I also say that we have a second envoy who is French-speaking, Bill Fisher, who's a former member of the department, a very senior, experienced former ambassador who speaks French beautifully, so he's supporting the campaign in French-speaking countries. We also, of course, have very much the senior executive service of this department very much behind the campaign, including, of course, the Secretary and the Deputy Secretaries, myself. So we would anticipate that this vote in October is going to be quite close. We're not anticipating that there will be a big margin one way or the other. So what that means is that we have to run this campaign frankly, at full tilt right up until the vote, and we're not going to leave any stone unturned. Another thing that, Senator, I'd like to mention is that we have 5 campaign themes for our bid, and it's very important to us that we fill out these campaign themes.
And the themes are?
And the themes are, the rights of Indigenous people, good governance, gender equality, national human rights institutions, and freedom of expression. And to just give you one example of what we do with, say, the National Human Rights Institution campaign pillar, we're making sure that that pillar has real substance. Australia has been long a supporter of national human rights institutions. We lead on this resolution in the Human Rights Council, even when we've not been a member of the Council. That resolution has 90 co-sponsors. We also do a lot of work with countries like Laos and Vietnam, where we do capacity building. We also fund a group called the Asia Pacific Forum for Human Rights Institutions, which is based in Sydney, and it does work with national human rights institutions throughout our region. And what we're doing there is making sure that, of course, our credentials are strong and intact.
So how does our campaign differentiate itself from that of the French and the Spanish?
The campaigns inevitably have some similarities. To be frank, in the end, these campaigns follow some pretty well-worn practices and tactics. Each campaign will put forward campaign themes. What we are doing is very much stressing that we would bring particular value to the council. We would make, frankly, a different kind of council member. We come from the Asia-Pacific region. We would be the first country to serve on the council from the Pacific region, so we would give the Pacific a voice. We would also bring a Commonwealth perspective to the council's work. Frankly, we have earned a very good reputation in being a bridge builder. And so we have demonstrated, as we did when we were on the UN Security Council for 2 years, that we're able actually to straddle differences, and we bring a very practical approach to taking forward the work of the UNSC, and in this case, if we get elected, the HRC. So we would feel very much that we can bring something different to the council's work, as we come from a different part of the world. Europe is customarily well represented on the council, and Australia would be able to bring that Asia-Pacific perspective and a very practical perspective.
So when we're in this campaign period and as we're approaching, election day or voting day, do we temper our public statements or attitudes around particular foreign policy issues?
No, in fact, we have taken some very strong stands in the last year while we've been running this campaign. One I'd mention is that we joined with 11 other countries a joint statement on China, where we expressed our concerns about particular human rights issues in China. I thought that was a very good test of our willingness to strike the right balance between saying something authentic on human rights, not resiling from where we stand, but also not to go overboard. So I think we've been very careful to make sure that our credentials on key human rights issues are intact. And even though we're not a member of the council at this point, we're actually one of the most active non-members, and we're very constructively engaged in the current workings of the council.
Thanks very much. I just want to turn to the issue of human rights abuses in Chechnya.
Yes.
And perhaps someone could just sort of step me through where Australia got its evidence from, how reliable that evidence was, what led to the framing of the Foreign Minister's statement, and in particular the use of the words concerned, mass arrests, and then to talk to us about what the approach to the Russian government involved.
The evidence that has come to light has come from a variety of sources, especially major reputable human rights organisations like Amnesty International. That information indicates that in all likelihood some very serious abuses have taken place. On the basis of that credible information, we have on 5 separate occasions raised our concerns with the Russian government, both in Moscow and here in Canberra, and the Foreign Minister has also articulated her point of view. So from our point of view, it's clear to us that there's credible evidence of abuses having taken place. Would take note of the fact that President Putin has said to his human rights ombudsman that she should investigate this situation and report back to him. So we would welcome that and we would look forward to the results of that investigation.
So the 5 separate representations to the Russian government, can you just detail what each of those have been? You mentioned that some had taken place in Moscow and some had taken place here in Australia. I'm just sort of keen to properly understand when we say representation, does it mean like the Kimberley process, for example, where the ambassador is called into the Foreign Affairs Department, or does it mean the writing of a letter or the sending of an email? I'm just keen to understand what are those 5.
I can run through each of the 5 occasions. Our ambassador in Moscow, Peter Tesh, raised our concerns with the Russian Foreign Ministry in Moscow on the 10th of April. Our concerns were then formally communicated by diplomatic note sent by our embassy in Moscow on the 13th of April. This note sought information on the arrests and whether any Australians were affected, which appears, we think, not to be the case. Thirdly, the matter was the focus of discussions in a 27th of April meeting between the embassy and again the Foreign Ministry. Here in Australia, the head of our Northern, Southern and Eastern Europe branch, Mr Kevin McGee, raised our concerns with the ambassador here in Canberra. That was on the 28th of April. And then most recently...
Is that a telephone call? Is that a formal meeting?
I think that was in person, but I'll check on that, but I'm fairly certain it was in person. And the last occasion was when the FAS of our Europe division, First Assistant Secretary of our Europe division, Louise Hand, raised our concerns at the senior officials talks, which were held in Moscow on the 15th of May.
Thank you for that. That's most enlightening. I think a lot of that would be new to Australians. Just finally, because you've been very generous, Chair, with your time, I just want to go to the issue of the use of words. So, for example, countries similar to Australia, the United States and Britain, for example, have, I'd argue, used much more stronger language. We use the words mass arrest, for example, whereas the Americans have talked about kidnapping, torture and murder. The British Deputy Foreign Secretary has talked about the words tortured, described them as despicable, cited 4 deaths. And I'm just wondering whether or not our language has been strong enough, or whether or not our language has been consistent with the approach that we've taken in perhaps similar situations previously.
Senator, I would note that we, in fact, in our discussions with the Russians, have referred to apparent evidence of assaults, torture and killings.
Oh,
so
okay,
we haven't
excellent.
just said arrests, we've actually been fairly frank
Yes.
in describing what appears to be the dimensions of some very serious abuses.
But I'm correct in, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but the government statement hasn't referred to those words, though, has it? I don't think it has, but if it has, I'm happy to stand corrected. So,
I would have to look at the language which was used in the diplomatic note. That is the formal piece of paper that we've handed across, and check that for you.
that would be, and if that can be made available, I'd be most appreciative of that. So, thank you, Chair, for your time, and can I just compliment officials on what appears to be a very thorough representation of Australian concerns. Thank you.